Bonjour tout le monde. Mon nom est Louis Baumier, directeur exécutif de l'Institut de l'énergie de Trottier. Hi everyone, my name is Louis Baumier, executive director of the Institut de l'énergie de Trottier. On my name and on behalf of Natural Resources Canada, I want to welcome you and thank you for attending this additional or extra webinar organized in the context of the Energy Modeling Initiative. A few words about the Energy Modeling Initiative. This is a Natural Resources Canada funded project that's been on for 2 years now with the intent of answering those big questions on what we actually need in terms of decision making and stakeholders, what are the existing capacity in terms of modeling and that can support those decision makers, and what kind of structure should be put in place in order for most efficient decision making. A few housekeeping notes. The webinar should last no more than an hour, including Q&A period. It is being recorded and the slides will be made available on the EMI website. During the presentation, please keep your microphone on mute. Use the chat box to post questions and comments. And during the question and answer question, please raise your hand before asking a question. It is my great privilege to present you our today's speaker, Viviane Aubin. Quick bio on her. Well, she's a candidate to engineering profession, currently working at Hydro-Québec Production. She holds a bachelor degree in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in energy engineering, both from Polytechnique Montréal. Driven by a strong environmental awareness and a will to contribute to global decarbonization, Viviane specializes in energy grid analysis and modeling. She is the recipient of several scholarships. Among those, there is one from the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier, but most importantly, she got the Order of the White Rose, or the Ordre de la Rose Blanche, for her remarkable achievements and commitments to environment. Well, just a few notes on this scholarship. It's been created as a tribute to the victims of December 6, 1989 femicide that costed the lives of 14 young women and injured several others at the Polytechnique Montréal. So without further ado, I will give the control to
I don't know why the sound is not on. Better.
That will start our presentation. Viviane?
Good sound on the computer itself?
Should be on the screen.
Oh.
Thank you, Louis, for this kind introduction. So if everything's fine, you should be seeing my screen. Yeah?
Yes, it's good.
Excellent. So thank you, Louis, for this kind introduction. So thank you also to the Energy Modeling Initiative to invite me. It's very appreciated. So the work that I will present to you today is, the title will be How Quebec Can Support the Energy Transition of Northeastern North America. So it is the outcome of my master's research, and it is the result of a joint work with Marc Aublé, also from Hydro-Québec, and also with Miguel Anjos, who is with the Polytechnique Montréal and University of Edinburgh. So I'll kick it off with a little view of the outline. So I'll start with an introduction on the energy transition and Hydro-Québec, and I'll then move on to describe the models that we used for our simulations. Then I'll present the numerical results that we obtained, and I'll conclude by answering or trying to answer the famous question, will Hydro-Québec be the battery of the North American Northeast? So I think the audience is quite familiar with the energy sector, but let's remind us that as variable renewable energy sources grow, well, issues within power grids arise. VRE growth has been a strong trend for several years now, but it's interesting to look at 2020. When despite a decline in global energy demand, obviously because of the pandemic that we're now living in for more than 1 year, Well, renewable energy demand kept growing, and this is mainly due to variable renewable energy sources that I'll call VRE, such as wind and solar. And this is good news because VRE will be essential to decarbonize power grids and eventually the economy. But however, we must be prepared to tackle the VRE related issues that must be addressed. So what are these issues? So the main ones, first we have uncertainty of generation. VRE generation depends on weather, and as we all know, weather forecasts are not always very reliable, especially in the long term. Another issue that we have is the intermittency and variability of generation. The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And finally, we have also a mismatch with demand. VRE generation is not always very well synchronized with demand peaks. So given all of these issues, there is a clear need for flexibility in terms of power grid management. And then we have storage hydropower, which seems to have features that could be interesting for VRE integration. First, storage hydropower features obviously energy storage. So with storage hydropower, we have reservoirs where we can store water that will ultimately be transformed in energy. We also have dispatchable generation with storage hydropower. So we can produce less or more according to the present demand. We also can quickly change the generation levels again to match the demand levels. Another thing very quite interesting, especially these times, is we have low GHG emissions with hydropower, especially in northern regions. And finally, hydropower is quite a cheap energy resource. So in Quebec, your northern region, we have Hydro-Québec, which is the main power utility in Quebec, and it is one of the largest hydropower producers in the world. There's a total installed capacity of 37 gigawatts, which is more or less the annual peak of demand in Quebec. And we also have 176 terawatt hour of storage capacity in reservoirs. And this is almost as much as the total annual demand in Quebec, which is a lot. So inside of Quebec, we don't have much VRE installed for now, with a bit less than 4 gigawatts of wind and a negligible amount of solar. But those valuable features for VRE integration may soon prove useful for the neighboring grids, because their VRE growth is important. And they are also setting decarbonization targets. So interest toward Quebec hydropower is rising. And we must also know that currently HU has a total max export capacity that amounts up to 8,000 gigawatts for now. So there is space for coordination with the neighboring grids. However, recent commercial agreements require steady flows from Quebec. So neighboring grids are buying steady energy from Quebec. Our point today is that a more flexible behavior might be more useful for VRE integration. There already have been several studies on interregional coordination between grids, especially in regions where there's already a significant hydropower generation fleet, such as Norway's. There have also been studies that focus especially on Northeastern North America, but they use they use models that aggregate HQ's generation fleet. So our contribution is to bring a study with very detailed models of HQ's generation fleet in order to really assess the impacts of the energy transition on technical terms for HU's generation fleet. So this is one of our first questions that we tried to answer. And the other one is, can HU actually take the role of a giant battery for its neighboring grids, as many studies try to suggest? Because what that means is that we could use hydro flexibility to compensate for VRE issues, so to produce more or store more whenever needed. So now the models that we use to carry our study are the models that Hydro-Québec uses day to day to plan its in generation. So these models were developed for HU's operations. The first model covers medium-term horizons, so about a few years, and the other model considers more like short-term horizons that range from a few days to a few weeks. And both are really based on a very detailed representation of all current generation and transmission assets. So we can have a very specific view of all the plants, of all the reservoirs. And a few modifications have been made to adapt the models to for theoretical scenarios instead of more operational planning. Here we have a very, very simplified overview of the models. So it's just to give you an idea of what we consider in the model. So at each reservoir, we consider the inflows, and we can either spill the water if we have too much, or we can turbine it to generate electricity that can be transmitted on lines up to Quebec demand, or up to the neighboring grids to make exchanges. And obviously we can also buy to bring electricity in the system. So we have all of these variables for all of Quebec's assets, Hydro-Québec's assets. So we get to a very large problems with millions of variables and tens of millions of constraints. The main constraints that are included in the model are operational limits on the various variables that are included in the model, so flows, volume, generation, and transmission. We also have a water conservation constraint at each plant and water systems, which basically means that what goes in must go out. We also include the maintenance schedule of the generating units, so that we don't consider that all units are available at all times. We also impose, obviously, a balance between supply and demand. And we included hydropower generation functions to get a very precise view of the plant's generation. And these functions are quite complex because what it says basically is that the power generated depends on the product of the flow, the Q, and of the height of water in the reservoir H. So it is non-linear, so it is more complex. And so this is a bit more information on the models that we used. We used both models because this way we have more complete information. With the medium-term model, as we look at a few years, we get the global annual behavior of the fleet as an output. On the other hand, the short term gives us very precise information on unit commitment on a specific time period that we chose to study based on the previous simulation with the medium term. A part of that, both models maximize revenues for Hydro-Québec. They are both linear because we linearize the hydropower functions to facilitate the resolution. We have mixed integer in the short-term model in order to account for all of the units. And so, as I said, the time horizon is a few years for the medium term and a few days to up to a few weeks for the short term. And I'll bring your attention to the time step. So it's very simple for the short term. It's just a time step of 1 hour. But for the medium term, it's a bit more complex, but it's quite interesting. So the time step is 1 week, but we have hours aggregated into 5 groups based on load. So what does that mean? I have a little graph here to illustrate it. And this aggregation provides quite a good estimate of actual data. How it works is that each week is divided into 5 categories of hours. If the time step were a week without this grouping of hours, the modeling would be too simplistic, given the fluctuations of the different variables within the same week. On the other hand, if the time step were an hour, the problem would become too large to solve in a reasonable amount of time. Therefore, the week time step remains, but it is divided into 5 categories in order to refine the resolution. So the grouping of hours is made according to the corresponding level of load. So on the graph, we have the very high level, the high, medium, low, and very low. So the definition of these levels varies for each week. The high load level of a summer week may correspond to the low load level of a winter week. And for each week, 5 categories of hours are obtained, for which different values can be assigned to certain variables, such as the generation, as we can see on the graph. So we see that for this week, we only have 5 values of generation with the aggregated curve in green. But we can still approximate quite accurately the real data. So I think it's an interesting way to model to approximate the real behavior without just grouping the hours, let's say the night hours and the day hours. It's a bit more complex, and I think it does a pretty good job at approximating the real behavior. And our approach with these models was to simulate the energy transition through its effects on energy price profiles. And this way, we could use a lot of price profile scenarios as inputs and test a lot of different scenarios in our models. These price profiles were provided by 3 different organizations. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California, IHS Markit, which is like kind of a multinational, and we have the MIT CEPR, obviously in Massachusetts. So these provided different price profiles. We had reference cases with IHS Markit and the LBNL, so the low VRE and the PC 2020. So we had a reference case to which we could compare the other scenarios. And here I give an overview of what are the energy mix in all of those price profiles. So we studied the energy transition through prices. So this makes the assumption that VRE growth, at least in the medium term, will remain higher in HU's market than within Quebec. So we kind of we make the assumption that VRE growth for the next few years won't be it won't be a very important growth. And how does that work? How can we simulate energy transition with price profiles? It's because high VRE penetration will impact price patterns in the market surrounding HU. And the revenue maximization is quite consistent with harnessing HU's potential to efficiently balance supply and demand for its neighboring market. So it's quite simple, because when VRE generation is high, prices are low because their marginal cost is very low, as they don't need any fuel. So when prices are low, HU has an incentive to buy energy on the markets, and then it produces less, and water is stored, and it can be transformed to energy later. And when VRE generation is low, well, it's the other way around. So we get kind of a battery behavior with the HU generation fleet. So I said that high VRE penetration will impact energy prices. Here, to illustrate it, I have two price profiles, both from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I have the low VRE price profile, that is a reference case, and I have the high wind price profile that makes the assumption that in 2030, we would have 10% solar and 30% wind in the export markets of HQ. And the effect of this big share of VRE in the energy mix of the export market is first an increased variability of the prices. So if we look at this graph here of the average hourly per megawatt hour price, we have in the envelopes here are the percentiles 10 and 90 for the high wind price profile in blue and in gray for the low VRE. So we see that the envelope between those percentiles is much bigger with the high wind price profile, and even gets to close to zero quite often and at any time of the day. So we see an increased variability, but also something that comes to the eye quite easily is the average value that drops. So we see it on an hourly profile, but we also see it on the monthly profile, where clearly the high wind price profile is lower than the low VRE one. So then I'll move on to the main results that we got with those price profiles. So we performed simulations with all price profiles that I presented, but I will only discuss results with the price profile that I showed just earlier, so the low VRE and high wind, just for matters of simplicity. But I must say that results discussed, that I will discuss, consist of trends that could be noticed regardless of the price profile used. So first, changes in Hydro-Québec's operations seems to be mainly sustainable. What I mean by that is that surely generation will be a bit more variable as it partially balances VRE intermittency. So an impact that could have been important would be the impact on the number of unit startups and shutdowns. So when we start a turbine or we shut it down in order to follow demand. But what we saw is between the low VRE price profile and the high wind price profile, there is not much of a difference. It's quite similar. Actually, the number of units, startups, and shutdowns even decreases with the high wind price profile. And how can we explain that? We can look at the average generation, so the seasonal generation profiles of Hydro-Québec. And we see that when we give the model the high wind price profile, it tends to sell way more during summer nights than it does with the low VRE price profile. Because in the high wind price profile at night, well, obviously solar obviously doesn't produce at night. And also wind generation is quite low during summer. So we get to a point where we don't have much generation at these times. So prices are higher. So Hydro-Québec has an incentive to sell more on the market. And this way it can have a steadier generation throughout the day, which is quite positive because this way it can save some unit startups and shutdowns. And we want to reduce the number of unit startups and shutdowns because each time we play with those with those maneuvers, it wears down the turbines. So that's it for the daily operations, but we must also look at the maintenance, which is a very, very important issue for Hydro-Québec, especially with the generation fleet that's getting older every day. So optimal maintenance planning would become more of a challenge with high VRE, because as new hydro generation patterns become more profitable in view of VRE growth in the region, well, we see that the optimal periods for maintenance become more variable over weeks. So there is much less predictability. So it stresses the importance of accurate forecast of VRE generation and flexible scheduling of maintenance if HQ wants to seize all the best opportunities on the markets. Another statement that we saw from our results is that, well, Hydro-Québec does have a great potential to provide storage services, but the economic incentive is low. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, we see that greater price variance caused by VRE growth results in more purchase resale operations. This we can see it in this graph here. So we see that with the high wind price profile, from one week to the other, the net amount of energy exchanged varies a lot more than with the low VRE price profile. Because what happens is just that HQ shifts its exchanges, so it shifts its generation as well, according to VRE generation. And meanwhile, it stores water in its reservoir in order to be ready for the next period where we will have low VRE generation. And this is these two curves were generated with transmission flows for the same amount of net exports. So we see that transmission flows are bigger, so we have much more things going on the transmission lines, but in the end we have the same amount of net sales coming from HQ. And this has an impact on how we manage the levels in the reservoirs. So here in this graph, we have the variation in storage in for the total amount of reservoirs that the HQ has. We see that throughout the year, HQ can provide storage that amounts up to a few terawatt hours, which is enormous in the storage sector. No battery can provide that much storage. So it is a very valuable amount, and especially annual or seasonal storage. It depends on how we see it, but this kind of storage is very interesting because it's a service that most commercial storage technologies cannot provide, because it implies to store the energy for a very long period. And with batteries, for example, we tend to use it more on a daily basis. So the thing, like how we must understand this is just that HQ can store excess energy generated by VRE in neighboring market and then return it when needed through purchase resale operation based on price arbitrage. And this can happen over the course of the year. So this all seems very interesting, but the thing is, we must know that when we got these results, we also saw that we only had about half of the revenues we had with the reference price with the high VRE prices. So high VRE prices give us about half of the revenues that we had with the reference case. So this must be taken, it's not to be taken directly. I mean, there are a lot of factors that can impact prices, but what we must understand from that is that even when transactions are optimized for revenues, they do not compensate for the forecasted energy value drop that we saw earlier. So the low marginal cost of VRE drive down the prices, and even if we do a lot of purchase resale operations from one week to the other, it does not compensate in terms of revenues. So I'll jump to the conclusion. What we must remember from all this is that Hydro-Québec does have the potential to facilitate the energy transition in Northeastern North America. So going back to the questions that we saw earlier. So first, we wanted to look at the impacts of the energy transition and HQ's large-scale hydropower generation fleet. So first, we saw that there is a lot of continuity in terms of unit startups and shutdown, which is very good news. We even saw a decrease of summer night load valleys, which is currently an issue. Hydro-Québec is trying to attenuate these summer night low valleys. So doing kind of the battery of the Northeast could help that. But we also saw that there would be an incentive to Hydro-Québec to improve flexible maintenance scheduling in order to react quite fast depending on weather forecast and really seize the best opportunities on the markets. And the other questions we had, well, can HQ actually take the role of a giant battery for its neighboring grids? What I won't answer by yes or no, but what I can say is that we see that there is a very high annual storage potential. With high VRE, purchase resale cycles get more profitable, but we also see a decrease in energy value. And what we can understand from all that is that Hydro-Québec could be the battery, but the current electricity market structure does not provide incentives for an optimal contribution from HQ to the energy transition. Right now, storage is not remunerated on the markets. So what it does is that the income generated by balancing services does not have a value presently, and the revenues can only be taken from price arbitrage, and it is far from compensating for the forecasted energy value drop due to VRE generation. And I'll conclude with that, saying that this study is very just the beginning of research on Quebec's positioning in the upcoming energy transition. There is a lot of further work that can be done and that actually has already been done. So should it be sensitivity analysis, also using stochastic modeling to better capture the uncertainty of water inflows, water VRE generation. There's also an initiative to better assess the HU's flexibility value. We're also trying to look at the impacts of the energy transition within the province of Quebec, because as I said, we looked at more the energy transition in the markets, but there will be changes within Quebec as well. And this might impact also the role of the battery that Quebec could take. Also, there's also the idea of providing ancillary services on the market that we're trying to look at. And eventually we'd like to integrate climate change impacts, because climate change will impact water inflows, load, VRE generation as well. So it's a very complex matter, but we'll have to address it if we want to get a more realistic view of what will happen. And I would also like to mention that there are ongoing collaborations with research groups. with some of them, we work with research group to give us some data, usually very aggregated, but to ensure realistic modeling of Quebec's energy system in order to make sure that external studies are relevant for Hydro-Québec and for the region also, because they get a more precise view of what Hydro-Québec can actually do. So among those groups, there are the MITC PR, obviously in Massachusetts, and REL in the US as well, and HEC Montréal in Quebec. So that's all for me, and I'll be pleased to answer your questions.
Merci Viviane, très très bonne présentation. So now the floor is open for questions. Vous êtes invité à poser vos questions en français également. Je vous demande de lever la main avant de poser vos questions. Si personne n'a de questions tout de suite, moi je peux bien en lancer une pour démarrer la période. Tu parles de, you're talking about the yearly storage capacity for Hydro-Québec, but have you looked at what could be done for more shorter term storage, like a daily or weekly storage? Is there a revenue stream there, or is that?
Yes, as I said, annual storage might be more interesting because it's something current technology cannot really provide. But yes, Hydro-Québec can totally do purchase resale cycles on a daily or weekly basis, or even on an hourly basis. But it's just, and it does provide revenue, but when I talk about the revenue that are generated, it includes as well the purchase resale cycles on a shorter time horizon.
Merci. Okay, some question from the chat. The storage timing is the same as for the water. Is that an issue for storage?
Can you repeat that?
So what I mean is that rain, I mean, essentially the rain also, the water is collected in the spring at the same time as you would have
Yes.
surplus wind. So is that an issue for storage?
Yes, well, actually, we might have to reconsider the constraints that we put on water levels, because we tend to try and keep our levels very low at the beginning of spring, when the water inflows are the most important. But if we want to do this battery thing, we might want to get a bit more aggressive with our levels, but it's not. It was a difference of on the graph that I showed. It was a difference of 3 or 4 terawatt hours, which is not much compared to the whole capacity of the reservoirs.
Merci.
There was a question from Caroline Lee. Caroline, I would invite you to ask your question directly, please.
Hi, thanks very much for the presentation. I was just curious about the relative importance of battery storage versus reservoir storage in the form of hydro. So particularly thinking about the role of EVs in this big picture. Is it important? Is it not so important, especially on the road to decarbonization?
I think that, well, especially on the road of decarbonization, we will need all the resources we can have. So this study is more focused on VRE generation, but EVs and batteries will have a role also. But we looked more on the bigger horizons, and I think that for now batteries will have value on shorter time horizons. So especially ancillary services. I talked about it a bit in my conclusion. Hydro-Québec might want to look at this option, but there's a lot of competition in this field, especially with batteries. So I think, so this is why I talk more also about annual storage, because I think this is a very a niche sector for hydropower because there's not much resources that can do that kind of service. But yeah, all of the resources we can have, they sure will contribute. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question talking about ancillary services. Is there, you said that Hydro-Québec potential for providing ancillary services. Do they consider participating in US market for ancillary services?
For now, there are a lot of constraints that prevent Hydro-Québec to participate in the US market for ancillary services, but it's something they're beginning to look at because there might be opportunities. But I think a thing that we're sure about is that ancillary services could give a bit of revenue, but it won't compensate either for the drop of energy value. It's the revenue that the Hydro-Québec can get from the ancillary services market is quite low.
Mm-hmm. Hence the need for a redesign of the market at some point, right?
Yes.
Any more questions? Please feel free to just raise your hand if I skipped your question. I'm going through the there's one question from Mark Purdon. Mark, can you go with your question, please?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just on participating at distance. It's really the question of the modeling. Are the models accounting for or able to account for potential rise in costs of fossil-derived electricity in Canada as well as in the Northeastern United States? In the Northeastern United States, I think there's sort of a renewed, under the Biden administration, a renewed interest in renewable energy, either paying more for renewables or putting a price on carbon for carbon-derived electricity. I wonder if that might enter into the modeling.
Yes. So all of these factors surely impact the price profiles. So in the models price profiles are just inputs. So we don't consider those things, but we're presently looking at models where we could model that focus on the whole North America. And so with these models, we could generate our own price profiles and try with different prices of carbon and different policies. And yes, so we could consider, but in this study, we just took price profiles that were generated obviously before Biden's election. But yeah, it's something where we'd like to look at.
There's also one question on the the platform used for optimization coding.
So the optimizer is CPLX, and the models are coded in OPL, which is a language from IBM. But there's like they were developed quite recently, and they're always being improved every year. So, but they are very complex models because they really take into account all of the assets. So it's quite big models.
So any more questions? We still have a few more minutes. No?
I have a question.
Yes, please go.
Okay. Have you accounted for the change in the load in Hydro-Québec if Hydro-Québec wants to go? I mean, if Quebec wants to go with electrification of transports and so on, it seems like the local load will spring up a lot.
Yeah. Yes. So in this study, we made the assumption that the load in Quebec would rise by around 10 or 12 terawatt hours, which is the forecast made by Hydro-Québec distribution.
Oh.
But we kept the same profile from one day to the other. But yes, we assumed that the demand would be more important in Quebec. The load would be greater.
Okay, and the second question is the transmission lines. It seems there's going to be a lot of traffic both ways with this type of
Yes.
exchanges. Are they able to sustain this kind of traffic with the current infrastructure? Or
yes, when we modeled in the models, we consider the transmission, the ramps in the transmissions, that the limits in ramps, in transmission ramps. So we can't jump from 0 to 2,000 megawatts in 5 minutes. But so we accounted for them. But obviously, if we have more transmission lines, we'll be able to move even more, to have more purchase resale cycles, and it will be even more challenging for Hydro-Québec. But we see that with the transmission lines that they are currently, the impacts on the operations are manageable.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question.
Yes, please go.
Yeah,
Yes.
so thanks for the presentation. It was really great. So I just to make sure that I understand this correctly, is the bottom line is that Hydro-Québec thinks using hydropower to store seasonally wind and solar generation will not make financial sense in the future, as in the utilities will prefer to just curtail or dump their surplus wind and solar and then generate the power when they need it? Is that what?
Yes. Well, for the sake of the whole region, the best option would be that we would use this hydropower's flexibility to balance the VRE generation. But the bottom line is that for now, there is not an incentive on the market structure for Hydro-Québec to take that role and really have impact on its operations. So it might decide to, let's say, focus more on its own grid in order to protect its operation and not have a bigger impact than what we forecast. So in order to give Hydro-Québec really an incentive and make sure that they would be available and ready to do the battery for the whole region, well, it might be interesting to review the market structure. And we're not the first ones to say that. There are a lot of studies and authors that talk about this issue, the fact that storage is not remunerated for now. And the more we have VRE in our grids, the more disconnected from reality it will be.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have a few more minutes. Any more questions? No? Going once, going twice? Well, thank you again, Viviane. Merci beaucoup. Je vais reprendre le contrôle de l'écran si tu le permets.
Oui.
Je crois que tu dois arrêter le partage. Ou je peux le faire de mon côté peut-être. Okay, just before leaving you, thanking again Viviane, I would like to announce, make a kind of a bit of auto promotion for the work we are currently completing. We will organize another webinar in the July, August timeframe to present the results of our Canadian Energy Outlook, Horizon 2060, that will present some net zero modeling for the 2050 time horizon, but we're going to be looking a bit further after 2050. So stay tuned for the exact date. We will send you an email. And I will also invite you, if you do have a modeling project that you would like to present, contact us at the address there, or contact me directly. we will make a pleasure of offering you the forum of the Energy Modeling Initiative and the network of people we do have on our list, or the list of contact we have, and organize something for you. Yes. With that, I will just say, well, thank you. Stay safe and enjoy the beginning of the deconfinement, and enjoy the summer. Thank you, everyone, and talk to you soon.